Good afternoon and welcome back to the Hillsdale College Constitution Town Hall. We're pleased that you can join us today as we continue through our trek exploring the Constitution with the ultimate objective of, in fact, reviving the Constitution. This afternoon we're going to turn now from America's founding and the Civil War period to the progressive era, as it's sometimes called. If you're interested in finding more about the progressive movement, there are many books about them, but none better than a collection of readings that was assembled by our next speaker. American Progressivism is edited by Ronald J. Pestritto. We're pleased that he's joined us today, a Hillsdale College professor. He has written a lot on Woodrow Wilson. I should ask of all of you that as you consider and listen to the talks, the remaining two presentations today, if you have a question that pops into your mind, or if you have a question about any of the morning's proceedings, or anything that might pertain to Hillsdale College, what we're doing in Washington, or any of the other programs, if you're interested in admissions information, please email us. The easiest email to use is kirbycenter@hillsdale.edu. kirbycenter@hillsdale.edu. We're going to now turn to our program on American Progressivism, and I'm going to ask Hillsdale College student Andrew Odell to come forward and introduce our speaker. Andrew is a junior. He's interning at the Heritage Foundation this semester. He's studying, interning there at the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Andrew.
R.J. Pestritto is Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution and Associate Professor of Political Science at Hillsdale College. He is a Senior Fellow with the Kirby Center. Dr. Pestritto earned his Bachelor of Arts, magna cum laude, at Claremont McKenna College, and his Master's and Doctorate in Government at the Claremont Graduate University. He is the author of Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of Modern Liberalism, the editor of Woodrow Wilson, The Essential Political Writings, and the co-editor of American Progressivism, a reader, Challenges to the American Founding, Slavery, Historicism, and Progressivism in the 19th Century, and the American Founding and the Social Compact. He has also written for the Claremont Review of Books and the Wall Street Journal. He is a frequent guest on the Fox News channel as recently as last night. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pestritto as he speaks on the topic, the Progressives' Constitution.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks to the Kirby Center for inviting me to participate and get the chance to speak to you this afternoon. And thanks for coming out and braving the weather we're having here in the greater D.C. area. The program this morning, the previous sessions, sort of concentrated on America's first principles and the reason, therefore, for America's greatness. And as is usually the case, I've been given the role of throwing some cold water on the festivities. It's my duty to talk about where things went off the rails in America's political tradition, and that's usually my job. It I think is an important one because if we aim to go about restoring what is good about our country, we certainly first have to understand where it is that we lost our way. My own scholarly work over the last several years, as Andrew mentioned in his introduction, is focused on the progressive era. My earlier work was on the founding period, but the more I studied the founding, the more it was fairly clear that there is a very wide gulf between the principles of the founding and the way in which we govern ourselves today and the principles of our current political culture. So this led me on a sort of a journey in search of the reason for this gulf, and that led me to the progressives. So today I want to say something about the progressive movement, which I hope will prepare us for the day's concluding discussion of the problem of our current administrative state and some possible ways forward. Thought I'd talk first about liberalism today, or today's liberals, and to observe the fact that today's liberals, for the most part, seem to think that it's too dangerous for them to be known as liberals. Instead, as you've probably noticed, the popular term that they use to refer to themselves is now progressives. And if you think back to the presidential campaign of 2008, there was a particularly memorable debate on the Democratic side where Mrs. Clinton was asked directly if she considered herself to be a liberal. And she made it very clear that she wanted nothing to do with that label, but said instead that she considered herself to be a proud, modern American progressive. And indeed, as you may recall, she often referred to her agenda as a progressive vision for America. Now, in one sense, it's certainly the case that the aversion to the word liberal today is a legacy of the national political debate of the 1980s. This is where a liberal became a dirty word, and it still is to a certain degree in American politics. But I think more importantly, liberals today identify themselves as progressives because modern liberalism really has come home to its progressive roots. Right? Modern big government liberalism, as opposed to classical or founding era liberalism, modern big government liberalism was born in America's progressive era. For Mrs. Clinton, at least, the term progressive, I think, was not simply some kind of vague platitude, not simply a nicer way of saying liberal. She made clear that she had the progressive era in mind, explained in response to that question in the presidential debate, no, go back to the turn of the 20th century. That's where I'm placing myself. So what was this progressive era? What is the connection between it and modern liberalism? Well, the progressive era was the first major period in American political development to feature as a primary characteristic the open and direct criticism of the U.S. Constitution. Now, of course, while criticism of the Constitution can be found during any period of American history, the progressive era was really the first time where that kind of criticism formed the backbone of a movement. Right? The progressive era criticism of the Constitution did not come simply from a few, fringe characters. Right? Rather, the most prominent thinkers, the most prominent politicians of that era made those criticisms of the Constitution. Readers are reminded in almost any progressive text that they pick up that the Constitution is old, that it was written to deal with circumstances that had long ago been replaced by a whole new set of pressing social and economic ills, crying out for a new kind, an expansive kind of government problem solving. Now, our progressives understood the intention and the structure of the Constitution very well. They knew that the Constitution established a framework for limited government. They knew that these limits were to be upheld by a variety of institutional mechanics, for lack of a better term, a variety of institutional restraints and checks. They also knew that the limits placed on the national government by the Constitution represented major obstacles to implementing the progressive agenda of public policy. What did they have in mind? They had in mind a variety of proposals, a variety of legislative programs aimed at regulating significant portions of the American economy and society. They were aimed at redistributing private property in the name of social justice. The Constitution, if interpreted faithfully and accurately, stood in the way of this progressive legislative agenda. Now, the Constitution, of course, was only a means to an end, and that's something that was talked about at some length in this morning's sessions. The Constitution was crafted and adopted for the sake of achieving the natural rights principles of the American Declaration of Independence. The progressives also understood this fact very clearly. And it's why that so many of the more theoretical works that progressives wrote feature very sharp attacks on what we call social compact theory, basically on the principles of the Declaration, and the notion that the fundamental purpose of government is to secure the individual natural rights of citizens. And this is why in the reader that our studio audience has here before them, one of the things that I included, the first selection, is a lecture by a fellow by the name of Frank J. Goodnow, who is a very important progressive intellectual. And if you want an example of a progressive era piece that really has to go after the theory of the Declaration, the theory of social compact, the idea that natural rights are the end of government, that Goodnow piece is a very nice encapsulation of this kind of progressive argument. It begins on page 101 of your reader, if you have it. Now, while most of the founders and while nearly all ordinary Americans did not subscribe to some of the more radical implications of some of the social compact philosophers in the Western political tradition, they did believe, in line with the English political thinker John Locke, that men as individuals possessed rights by nature, rights that any just government was bound to uphold, and rights which stood as inherent limits to the authority of government over individual liberty and property. Right? So the regulatory aims and the redistributive aims of progressivism were therefore on a collision course with the political theory of the founding. Right? And this basic fact, of which, again, progressives were very well aware, it makes understandable Woodrow Wilson's admonition. And this was in an address ostensibly honoring Thomas Jefferson. Wilson admonished, quote, "If you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not repeat the preface." The preface would be that part of the Declaration, with those small items like natural equality, God-given rights, and all of that unimportant stuff. Right? Don't repeat that. What are you left with? You're left with the litany of grievances against George III. That is to say, you're left with the Declaration which is applicable only to that period of time and doesn't have any relevance going forward. Now, to make what can be a very long story reasonably short, and some students in the room who've had me in class know that this can be a long story. They've had the longer version of it. But to make it reasonably short, out of mercy for you, I want to say something about the administrative state today and its origins. And I define the administrative state as one where the extent of governmental power is defined not by the enumerations of it that are in the Constitution, but instead by whatever perceived social ill happens to catch our attention at a given moment. And we're a large, unelected, bureaucratic apparatus that has been set up to regulate virtually every aspect of our economy and society on the basis of expertise as opposed to consent. This is the administrative state, and it is the fulfillment of the progressive's dream for transforming American government, or at least it goes a long way toward fulfilling it. Progressives imported the philosophy of the all-powerful state into America from Europe. And this philosophy of the all-powerful state was the driving force behind the programmatic liberalism of the 20th century. And beginning in the progressive era, from the progressives to the New Deal to the Great Society, and really maintained by the presidential administrations of both major political parties. From the 1880s into the 1920s, and even beyond, the likes of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, Herbert Crowley, and a host of others contended that the American Constitution was outdated, it was no longer appropriate for the economic and social ills of contemporary times, that if applied at all, This is a phrase you've probably heard before, that the Constitution ought to be applied as a so-called living document. Right? That notion of a living Constitution, that language of a living Constitution, which of course now is a pillar of modern liberalism, and one hears it in debates about Supreme Court nominations and big Supreme Court cases. That language comes from the progressive era. And before that, it came from the historicism of German political philosophy, which is where the progressives learned it. The progressives, I should add, had a robust German pedigree. Almost all of them were educated in Germany or had as teachers those who had been educated in Germany. Now, what did the progressives get from the Germans? Well, among other things, they took from the Germans their championing of the state over the individual, a notion which drove their policy agenda as they looked to redistribute wealth, as they looked to use the national government to superintend private business and other aspects of the economy and our society. As I've said, this agenda ran squarely up against the natural rights principles of the founding, the limited scope of our national government under the Constitution. But as Theodore Roosevelt is reported to have quipped when he was challenged about his intrusion on property rights during a coal strike in 1902, to hell with the Constitution when people want coal. Now, some contend, perhaps correctly, that remark is apocryphal, but nonetheless they ought to consider that the remark simply encapsulates the progressive philosophy of government that Theodore Roosevelt very clearly and very deliberately endorsed on numerous occasions. There may be no better example of this than Roosevelt's speech that he called the New Nationalism, which he gave in 1910. This is after he had returned from Africa, was becoming dissatisfied with the Taft administration, and was set soon thereafter to launch his bid to recapture the presidency. And this is a speech I've included in your reader as well. It for those of you in the studio audience who have it begins on page 107. In that speech, Roosevelt called for the state to take an active role in effecting economic equality, both equality of opportunity, as he called it, and equality of reward. How? By having the government superintend the use of private property. Private property rights, which had been serving as a brake on some of the more aggressive progressive policy proposals, were to be respected, Roosevelt argued, only insofar as the government approved of the property's utility. Okay. And if we take a look at that New Nationalism speech, if you have it in front of you, on page 110 of your reader, here's a passage from Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech on this very point. Roosevelt said the following: "We grudge no man a fortune in civil life, if it is honorably obtained and well used. It is not even enough that it should have been gained without doing damage to the community. We should permit it to be gained, only so long as the gaining represents benefit to the community. This, I know, implies a policy of a far more active governmental interference in social and economic conditions in this country than we have yet had. But I think we have got to face the fact that such an increase in governmental control is now necessary." Right? So new circumstances, according to Roosevelt, necessitated a new conception of government. Natural rights were no longer to serve as a principled boundary that the state was forbidden from crossing. Woodrow Wilson had outlined a similar view of the extent of state power in a concise but very revealing essay called Socialism and Democracy. This I've also included in your reader, beginning on page 119. It's an essay that Wilson wrote in, I believe, 1887. The essay starts out by defining socialism, and it suggests that what socialism stands for is unfettered state power, which trumps or overcomes any notion of individual rights. Again, for those of you in the audience, on page 120 of your reader, Wilson says the following in this essay. Here he's defining socialism. State socialism is willing to act through state authority as at present organized. It proposes that all idea of a limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, and that the state consider itself bound to stop only at what is unwise or futile in its universal superintendence alike of individual and of public interests. The thesis of the state socialist is that no line can be drawn between private and public affairs which the state may not cross at will. All right, so that's socialism, according to Wilson. And after he lays out this definition of socialism in the essay, he explains he finds nothing wrong with it in principle, since it is merely the logical extension of how he understood genuine democracy. He says it gives all power to the people in their collective capacity to carry out their will through the exercise of governmental power, unlimited by any undemocratic idea like individual rights. As he goes on to explain, in fundamental theory, he says in this essay on the same page, in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. They both rest at bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Right? Not just socialism, but democracy. Men as communities are supreme as men over individuals. Limits of wisdom and convenience to the public control there may be. Limits of principle there are, upon strict analysis, none. So in this view, rights-based theories of government, like the republicanism to which the American founders subscribed, and of which Wilson, of course, was sharply critical, they're far less democratic than socialism. And as Wilson and his fellow progressives believed, rights-based theories of government limit the state's sphere of action. Right? And thus they limit the ability of people to implement their collective will and thus represent something less than real democracy. Right? So these general principles led to action on a wide variety of fronts, many of which dealt with social reform, educational reform, some of which even led to religious movements like social gospel, which was bound up with progressivism in some interesting ways. These are all very important, of course, but too numerous to get into in any detail here. Instead, let me mention more concretely, in the time that I have left, the progressive policy agenda, which included an array of proposals to regulate private business and property. Right? In many states, progressives had met with considerable success in winning enactment of these policies. Yet the federal Constitution, undergirded as it is by the idea of property rights, continued to provide a formidable obstacle to these progressive policy successes, as did many of the state constitutions. And so state courts had, in many cases, overturned progressive legislative achievements, ruling that the new programs extended the power of government into the private sphere unconstitutionally. The most famous example, of course, probably the case of Lochner v. New York from 1905. It was a case overturning state regulation of baker's hours. This phenomenon of state courts stepping in and stopping legislation that was deemed to violate constitutional rights, this was the phenomenon that Roosevelt had in mind, Theodore Roosevelt, when he frequently railed against the judiciary. And he even called for people to be given the power through popular referenda to overturn state judicial decisions. He said that the courts were construing the due process clause, quote, as if property rights, to the exclusion of human rights, had a first mortgage on the Constitution. Now, at a more general level, the real problem, as progressives saw it, was a failure of the courts to see the Constitution as a living organism, one whose limitations on government ought not be read strictly or literally, but instead interpreted to fit the new demands of a new age. For Woodrow Wilson, the structure of the Constitution itself made it nearly impossible for progressively inclined interpreters to adapt it to their agenda. The Constitution rested at bottom, of course, on a system of divided powers, both between the federal and state levels, and then within the federal government itself between the different branches of government. And so you had, in Wilson's view, this idea that the progressive force of history had brought about this great unity in the public mind, but the problem was the Constitution divided power in such a way so as to make expression of that unified will a near impossibility. It was for this reason that Woodrow Wilson detested the separation of powers, and that almost everything he wrote on the American system of government contained a sharp critique of separation of powers. The ideal model for Wilson was a parliamentary model. He was an Anglophile, where the legislature and the executive are essentially unified, both rising or falling on the evolving public opinion. Indeed, many of Wilson's early writings, by the way, advocated actual changes to the Constitution to make it more amenable to a parliamentary style. The separation of powers, as Wilson explained, had come out of the founders' obsessive fear of majority tyranny and their obsession especially with property rights. And the problem was outlined by Wilson on the campaign trail in 1912. I've given you a speech from his 1912 presidential campaign. It's called "What is Progress?" for those of you in the studio audience. And I'd like to read you a passage from that speech on page 117. This sums up Wilson's critique of the Constitution. Wilson wrote, or he actually said on the campaign trail, "The makers of our federal Constitution read Montesquieu with true scientific enthusiasm. They were scientists in their way, the best way of their age, those fathers of the nation. Jefferson wrote of the laws of nature, and then by way of afterthought and of nature's God. And they constructed a government as they would have constructed an orrery, to display the laws of nature. Politics in their thought was a variety of mechanics. The Constitution was founded upon the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. The trouble with this theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing." And there's that language of the living Constitution, right? "It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live." Sort of this great Wilsonian phrase. So what had to happen here in Wilson's view? American government needed to be reformed. It needed to reflect the essential unity of the public mind that progressives believed had been brought about by history. So separation of powers had to be discarded. It had to be replaced instead by a system which separated politics and administration. And by this formulation, what they meant was that the national political institutions, Congress, the presidency, and so on, they ought to be democratized. They ought to be unified. And we're familiar with a lot of the progressive proposals that aimed to bring that about. Right? They ought to be brought into much closer connection with public opinion. At the same time, since progressives believed that the most contentious political questions had already been settled by historical development, the Civil War was really decisive in this regard, then the real work of government, they believed, was not in politics, but in administration, in these expert agencies. And figuring out what the experts in the agencies would do is they would figure out the specific means required to achieve what the people generally agreed they all wanted, or at least what the progressives said they all wanted. And it's in this way, of course, that the progressives became influential not only upon the development of our traditional political institutions, but also on the rise of the federal bureaucracy. And, of course, the very significant role played by federal agencies in setting and enforcing national policy today. Most policy in this country is made by federal agencies who have that power delegated to them with very broad or vaguely worded laws that come from Congress. So I'm going to stop there, I think, because I believe that Dr. Arnn will be taking up the topic of the administrative state, among other things, I suspect, in his remarks later. So we'll stop, and I'll look forward to taking your questions. And again, thanks for attending today.
We do have time for questions. I'd invite our studio audience members to go to one of the two microphones. Again, if you're at home watching, Kirby Center at hillsdale.edu. We'll begin with the question, and before I jump into that, I wanted to mention that the Hillsdale Town Hall Reader is online. It's at the Kirby Center website, so anybody can download that reader. And there's also a different version, a slightly larger version, and in fact it contains 100 documents essential to understanding the American Constitution. That's also located at the Kirby Center website. This question comes from Joe in Sherwood, Michigan. Yesterday at the House Republican retreat in Baltimore, President Obama declared, "I am not an ideologue." Yet throughout the campaign and since his inauguration, the president has declared that he is a progressive. Using the president's own words then, can a progressive not be an ideologue?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. In one sense, you have to remember that a movement that's sort of bound up with progressivism in some fairly complicated ways is pragmatism. And in a way, the idea of pragmatism, or somebody who's pragmatic, is of course exactly antithetical to someone who is an ideologue. What the pragmatists thought, and this of course was very congenial by and large to the progressive idea of a living constitution, was that you needed to have a kind of functional understanding of the Constitution, right? You needed to see the Constitution in light of the particular thing you wanted to bring about, the particular task that you needed the government to accomplish. And so in legal circles, we call this today functionalism. So in that sense, I think Barack Obama is very much someone who's pragmatic. That is to say, he is not willing to have the principles of the Constitution be an impediment to an agenda that he believes the government needs to follow. Now, the justification for this pragmatism or this progressivism is, of course, very ideological. There's a whole understanding of the role of the state that comes from certain principles that the progressives learned. I won't bore you to death by going into the origin of these principles in political philosophy. So I guess the answer to my questioner is yes, you can be both an ideologue and also pragmatic.
Our second question comes live from the studio. Sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Pestritto. I'm David Hamilton from Hillsdale, Michigan, by way of Woodbridge, Virginia.
Welcome.
And I'm curious if you would please, Jonah Goldberg in Liberal Fascism described how the education system as we know it today was built in part to remove God from the supreme beingship in the United States and replace that with the state. Could you discuss that function and how it's affected our ability to have a constitutional government?
Sure. We have to keep in mind that the relationship of progressivism and faith is complicated because many progressives, although certainly not all progressives, but many progressives were men and women of profound faith. Wilson himself among them, Theodore Roosevelt certainly. There was a close relationship between the progressive movement and the social gospel movement. At the Progressive Party convention in 1912, the party stalwarts were waving Bibles at the end and singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." So it's on the one hand, it's not the case then that progressivism is severed from some sort of faith. But I think the way your question put it goes in the right direction. That the faith was altered in such a way to see God's presence in the state. That God and the state, or God and the public enterprise, became one and the same. And so that the way that one expressed one's faith, the way one lived one's life, and again, in the view of most of these folks as a Christian, was to give of oneself to the enterprise of the state. And that too is very much a product of 19th century philosophy. It's what's going on in the Darwinian revolution. The idea that somehow, I guess we could say, you can see the way some progressives talk, certainly the way Wilson talked. He talked as if his public enterprise, his public policies were a manifestation of God's very will, and thus became, almost incredulous when people would resist, because it was essentially, like resisting the will of God itself, as Wilson understood that. I believe that was a very sincere view in his mind.
This is from Laura in Denton, Texas. So if the progressive ideology and agenda have been steadily advancing now for 100 years, then why don't you see a similar progression of thought in conservatism? Is it possible to have progress as a conservative? It feels as if sometimes all I have to say about politics is no, stop, or too much. How would a citizen like me convey a conservative message that is full of ideas and hope and real progress for America?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's why I think we have to realize that conservatism has to be something more than a mere disposition. It has to be more than a kind of a set of cautions or a kind of a tendency to uphold the status quo. If conservatives, and that's a very broad term, but let's say if those of us who value the Constitution and want to see it restored, if we're to make any headway, it seems to me, the questioner is exactly right. We have to be able to articulate what it is about the Constitution that's worthwhile. Right? Why is it that government ought to be limited? What are these rights? What are the foundation of these rights? Why ought they to be aimed at? Why ought they to be pursued and secured? That's the sort of positive brand of conservatism that it seems to me has to be understood and embraced. And the problem, I think, with a lot of elements of conservatism is right now it's just a kind of disposition. It's a kind of a caution. If you think about it, by the way, who are the people who really behave like conservatives today? Well, they're the people we would call liberals. Again, I'm thinking of the Supreme Court confirmation hearings, the spectacle that we often see. Who is it who is up there in those hearings, on those committees, calling for an adherence to precedent, cautioning against judicial activism? It's not the so-called conservatives, not the so-called right-wingers. It's the left. Well, why is that? It's because the present order is an order. It's a progressive liberal order. It's one that's been established both through judicial action and legislative action over the course of the last 80 to 100 years. That's the current American paradigm. That's where we are as a country and have been for a long time. Thanks again, really, to both political parties. And so, to simply have a disposition for caution or a disposition for the status quo. Well, the status quo, from the point of view of someone who's a constitutionalist, really isn't satisfactory. The status quo is the problem. So we need to be able to articulate, what is it about the Constitution that makes it worthy as an object of our devotion.
Melissa from Plymouth, Minnesota. How has the modern presidency been shaped by the progressives? What should the executive's role be comparing the founders to that of progressivism?
Well, I teach 2 courses on that at Hillsdale, a course on the presidency and a course on the progressives. And I treat this question in both of them at great length. So I suppose we can extend this for another hour or so, right? The session. I'm sure Dr. Arnn won't object to that. Very briefly, I have to say I think it's the case. This is a slight generalization, but the modern presidency is the progressive presidency. We look to the president today not simply as the leader of a single branch of government. And don't get me wrong, it's not like the Federalists didn't want an energetic executive. They did. That was a defect of the Articles, right? But they also believed very strongly in a separation of powers. Woodrow Wilson wrote famously and eloquently about this in his book Constitutional Government, which was published in 1908. And he said, the problem with this separation of powers arrangement is we don't have any leadership in this country. Leadership has to be lodged somewhere, and in our current system, it's sort of a three-headed monster. And so Wilson looked for somewhere, some entity out there in our system of government to kind of rise above the separation of powers and be able to bring all of the branches together and move them in the direction that he believed history was traveling. And initially, Wilson thought this might be Congress. As a young man, he figured out that was a mistake pretty quickly. And looked to the presidency, right? So the presidency for Wilson was something that wasn't simply about being an executive. It was about really being a leader. And Wilson distinguished between the constitutional aspects of the presidency and the political aspects of the presidency. And the constitutional aspects, that stuff in Article 2, the actual powers of the presidency, that's not really very important. What really matters is the president's connection to public opinion, his ability to be able to draw upon his popular mandate. He's the only officer who gets a national vote, other than the vice president, who runs with him on the same ticket. And he needs to translate that mandate, that popular vote, into a direction for the country as a whole. And so the presidency is the way we're going to rise above the separation of powers. Well, of course, that's exactly how we look at the president today. We look at elections as mandates. We look to our presidents, and again, this is something that has been forwarded by presidents of both parties, of course. We look to our presidents as popular leaders, as legislative leaders, almost as prime ministers, who are going to, we want to know on the campaign trail, what legislation are you going to pass when you become president? This, as you hopefully know by now, is not really the constitutional role of the president, although he's given a role in legislation through the veto. So it's a question that requires a much longer answer. But there is much about today's presidency that is the product of progressivism. I talked about Wilson, but you could say the same about Roosevelt as well.
This comes from Doug from Tucson, Arizona, and this will be our final question for this session. What did the progressives think of political parties?
Again, great question. I've tried to point out here that the progressive movement was not, strictly speaking, a partisan movement or the property of any one political party. Of course, you had TR and the Republicans and Wilson and the Democrats, and you had strong progressive elements of both parties. And so, as progressive ideology has moved forward over the course of the 20th and now 21st century, it's a bipartisan thing. In terms of what they thought about political parties, there was a bit of a dispute about that between the wing of the movement that was sort of headed by Theodore Roosevelt and the wing that was headed by Woodrow Wilson. They both had the same objective, however. They both thought that parties as they existed in the 19th century were an obstacle to progressive aims. They were undemocratic. They got in the way of the people being able to have their will expressed in governmental action. They were this unnecessary middle step. Party bosses were unaccountable. The party system was corrupt. Right? Where they differed was over what the remedy was. Wilson thought that parties could be reformed and be made the instruments or tools of progressive leadership. So Wilson said, look, we have this separation of power system. We got federalism. We got this fragmentation of power all over the place. If we could just make the parties accountable to the people, that's why he advocated primaries, right? If we can make the parties accountable to the people, put the amateurs in charge, not the professional party leaders, then they could be the tools of leadership, right? A strong president of a particular party could use his party ties to move all of the officials in the different branches of government in a single direction. It's a way of coordinating. It's a way of overcoming separation of powers, a way of overcoming federalism. So let's reform parties, but let's make them progressive tools. TR, Herbert Crowley as well, as progressive intellectual, was influential on TR, thought parties were incorrigible. The way they were, they could not be reformed. They would always remain obstacles to progressive aims, and so therefore they had to be done away with altogether. And so the Progressive Party, the rubric under which Roosevelt ran in 1912, was a kind of party to end parties.
Thank you very much.